Is there any utility to using these tests to find lower owned, overlooked value plays? That is, on any given slate, there's a handful of low 2K guys that pop up as chalky values that you may want to, I assume, play. Yeah, probably. Let's go ahead. Let's run one and see what it does. Let's run a big one because he finished off the question here. Pivot off of, but perhaps 150 lineup simmed might show how often one shows up in the optimal relative to others. Let's go ahead and look at it. And there's a big contest on... There's a big $5 on DraftKings tonight, so I'm going to run a big build. I want to run 1,500 lineups. I mentioned before, when I do this as my actual process, I always do it with 150 so that I get 1,500, and we'll look at this. What I think actually is more likely to happen here is I think rather than this popping value plays, I think what's actually going to pop is like ceiling one-off guys that are maybe likely to go low owned. Like Dodgers bats tonight against Gossman, right? Those guys any of those guys can hit a home run any at bat. They have a lot of power. And I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those guys showing up in optimal lineups and these research builds because they have that power. Even though Gossman is going to be very chalky and the Dodgers bats are probably not likely to. I think what we'll actually probably end up finding here is that the typical value plays, like the highly owned min price guys, like Cole Calhoun, I think is going to be probably one of those guys tonight. He's min price, batting in the middle of the order for the Diamondbacks, who have like a 5.0 run total, right? That's the exact kind of guy I'm talking about. That just gets really chalky. I wouldn't be surprised if that kind of player actually pops up less than you might expect because a traditional optimizer that's optimizing for mean projection is going to overvalue that type of player because he grades out really well point per dollar. But when you force it to look at ceiling, single game simulation, high variance outcomes, I would suspect that Cole Calhoun's probably doesn't pop dramatically higher than any of the other players in his price range. So we haven't talked too much about doing this for pitchers, but I do think it's also interesting to look at for pitchers. So, cool. So then what I will typically do here is just expand this up to 1,500. And this is like where I will start a lot of my builds. What is also really useful is you can, in some ways, kind of start treating this as you've got a sample size at this point of 1,500 where you can, I think, just directly compare exposure to projected ownership and start to get an idea of maybe where there is some leverage. Like if 32.4% of the field is rostering Gausman and he shows up in 28.8% of 1,500 lineups, again, by no means is this a big enough sample size that you could say that 28.8% is his absolute percentage of showing up as the one of the optimal two pitchers, but it's a lot of lineups, and I think you're getting to that point. I think you can start directly comparing projected ownership to exposure and start to see where some leverage opportunities is. So if Kevin Gausman truly does come in at 32.4% projected own, it might be that he is slightly over-owned given his chance of showing up in the optimal lineups. And then similarly make maybe, is there a pitcher that... So maybe like Greinke or someone isn't being owned enough, right? So, but let's go ahead and look at this. Let's see, maybe a good way to do this would be to just sort by value and look at what our significant value plays is. So yeah, you kind of are seeing this effect, right? Like Cole Calhoun is exactly as I described, right? He's like a ridiculous value play, 4.62. Naquin's another one tonight too. Really cheap, hitting in the middle of the order, team with a 5.5 total. He's going to pop in all typical projection systems, but you can see we're actually only getting like 4% and 3% of these guys. So, and I think these are actually probably very low for these players at this point in the day. I think they're both likely to be quite a bit more owned than it looks at the moment. And so kind of exactly as I was thinking, I think using this method might show you that these are actually plays that are likely to be overowned because of their mean projected outcome rather than appropriately owned. The other side of the coin is maybe we don't have like a ceiling column here, but just sorting by projection might be a good way to do this. I would be curious. I don't know the best way to do this, but let's see what our highest projected owned plays are. Hitters are so variant that like we're rarely going to get one guy that's just spectacularly highly owned. So maybe I will leave the point there, right? I think the point that is made here is that by running these builds, you will see that how a traditional optimizer can tend to overuse or overweight a player that has a high mean projected outcome, even if they are unlikely to show up in a great deal of optimals. So that I think is a good summary there. This is going to be a fun slate tonight, though. This isn't really an uber chalk slate. Like there are definitely going to be chalky teams, but there's a lot of teams right at around 5.5 runs, at least right now. I don't think there's any teams projected over 6 runs. So even amongst the top 5 or 6 best stacks, you're unlikely to have one team that's getting kind of crazy out of control ownership. I think pitching is interesting, with maybe the most expensive pitcher on the slate being the one going up against maybe the best overall batting order lineup on the slate, taken for what it is with Gosman up against the Dodgers. So it should be a fun slate tonight. I know there's some really big DraftKings contests too, which should be a lot of fun. The $5 150 max, which is terrible structured contest, but I know it's always kind of exciting. I have a bunch of tickets to that contest. DraftKings has been running satellites for the Platinum Sombrero for a couple months now, so I racked up a bunch of tickets. So I'm excited about that, but should be a good slate. But any other questions about anything really, but also in particular like these research builds that we've been talking about here, what the purposes of these, what we get out of this is, any other follow-up, anything at all. That is pretty much the last question I had in my queue here overall. Don't have too much else to say about this here. I guess kind of like adding on, building blocks, adding on something every day we talk about this. I think for pitchers in particular, we have a big enough sample size that it starts to become interesting to consider your leverage opportunities by just literally comparing ownership to exposure. And then secondarily, I think this provides some support to the overall idea that value plays are often overowned in baseball DFS. They don't have a significantly higher ceiling. They simply have a higher mean projection just because of their salary. And this kind of build demonstrates why that maybe is not, why coming in under on those players can be useful. But there's nothing wrong with taking like Naquin or Cole Calhoun in your stacks, right? If you're playing Diamondbacks or Red stacks, but I would probably avoid playing those guys as one-offs based on what I'm seeing here in a research build where they're like 3 and 4% optimal, and I think probably could be 20% owned. So